Hi everyone, and welcome to tonight's talk. My name is Maurice Casey. I am the DFA Historian in Residence here at EPIC, the Irish Emigration Museum, and it's great to welcome you to this, the fourth talk in our series of hidden histories of the Irish abroad. Tonight we're going to be looking at Irish, Jewish, and Irish Jewish histories. So a very big welcome to everyone who's joining us, who's attended our previous talks and is joining us again, and also those of you who are joining us for the very first time. Before we started, I wanted to give you an overview of how our talk is going to look tonight. So it's once more split into two parts. If you attended our Ireland the Black Atlantic talk, it's very like that one. It's going to begin with a talk from myself where I introduce the topic, and then we're going to speak with our experts. And we're very happy to be joined by Professor Hasia Diner of NYU in the latter part of our talk. My talk focuses in particular on my area of expertise, which as always is the 1920s and the 1930s. And we're going to go and look at Irish Jewish encounters abroad, location by location. Starting with, it wouldn't be a Maurice Casey talk if we didn't at least visit the Soviet Union once, beginning with Soviet Russia, then on to London's East End, New York's Lower East Side, before finishing up in Boston via Chicago. So, to begin my talk with perhaps a surprising starting place. In September 2018, in an archive in Moscow, I came across the story of an obscure cultural encounter between the Irish and Jewish diasporas. A short typescript autobiography on aged paper told the story of one Philip Candler, a Jewish tailor born into the Russian Empire who spent 2 decades of his life in England in the early 20th century advocating revolution. Inspired by the Russian Revolution in 1917 and dismayed by English trade unions, Candler decided to return to his homeland of Russia. Candler first travelled into German-occupied Ukraine. There he joined the Communist Party, then evacuated to Kiev after an anti-communist insurrection before being sent to the front line to fight the forces aligning against Bolshevism. At some point during his tumultuous career, between preaching revolts to English garment workers and taking up arms against Cossacks converging on Kiev, Comrade Candler found time, so he claimed, to translate Oscar Wilde's pamphlet, The Soul of Man Under Socialism, into Yiddish. He was wounded fighting the Cossacks, but eventually made it safely to Soviet Russian territory, where he requested to be sent back to Britain to continue the revolution. To date, that one letter is all that I can find in the curious life of Philip Candler, perhaps the first person in history to render the words of one of the great Irish writers abroad into the Yiddish language. Yet even the small glimpse into a lost world can help us trace the contours of the story we will be talking about this evening. Candler's story is a tale of the extraordinary mobility of working-class migrants in the late 19th and early 20th century, in addition to the fascinating linguistic polyphony of their world. The early modernist John Gallagher has suggested that while nowadays multilingualism is characterized as an elite phenomenon, this has not always been so. It's clear to any historian of Irish and Jewish history that in order to organize a day's work, or even a revolution a century ago, required that migrants regularly crossed national, cultural, and linguistic borders. Tonight, we're not charting the history of the Jewish community in Ireland, a topic that has inspired a number of great studies and memoirs over the decades. Rather, we'll be talking about how and where the Irish and Jewish diasporas encountered one another in their points of emigration. Significant sites of Irish and Jewish interactions were places like the Lower East End in New York and London's East End, the kinds of urban worlds where Jewish emigrants, people like Philip Candler, could contend with their Irish counterparts. Irish Jewish history more broadly is a developing field and, to my mind, one of the more exciting avenues of Irish historical and literary research. For anyone in search of an entry point to this history, I can recommend the 2018 collection of essays edited by Aidan Beattie and Dan O'Brien, Irish Questions and Jewish Questions, and that brings together many of the finest scholars currently working on the area. On Irish Jewish encounters abroad, Daniel Renshaw's scholarly study on East London Irish Jewish encounters provides a detailed analysis of communal life and politics in the decades before the First World War. And in December last year, Katrina Goldstone published Irish Writers in the 30s, Art, Exile and War, which contains focused studies of two Irish Jewish writers, Leslie Dakin and Michael Sayers, both of whom spent much of their careers beyond Ireland. The anecdote with which I opened this talk will probably give you a sense of where my own interests lie. I'm interested in Irish and Jewish encounters within radical movements. And while conservative commentators of the past look to Irish and Jewish ties to radicalism to make ominous warnings about untrustworthy migrants, I explored these ties to tell bigger stories about the limits of the world revolution of the early 20th century as a space where the borders separating migrant communities could be dissolved. In contrast to past conspiracies, I am also keenly aware that the revolutionary Irish-Jewish encounters I research were much more the exception than the norm. And I'm also interested in that hyphenated identity, Irish-Jewish, and the social histories of intimacy that went into creating the hyphen. These interests have naturally led me to researching London's East End. The Irish feminist Hannah Skeffington, speaking on a New York platform in 1918, made the claim that the world would be made safe for democracy through the combined efforts of the Russians, the Jews, and the Irish. It is these three elements, Skeffington stated, that are going to smash English imperialism and all other kinds of imperialism. If ever such a remarkable alliance was to come about, it would surely have had its genesis in London, areas like Whitechapel and Spitalfields, among the East Enders that the novelist Jack London referred to as the people of the abyss. In the mid-19th century, amid Ireland's Great Famine, the docks of the East End became the point of arrival for the Irish poor arriving into London, and later, between 1881 and 1914, these same streets would welcome an estimated 100,000 Jews from the Russian Empire who were fleeing persecution. In fact, Irish and Jewish immigrants had already started arriving in the East End before these two crises, but it was these cataclysms that befell both communities that would spur a dramatic increase in their outward migration. So here are just a few Irish-Jewish encounters from my own research into East London, a time that was in the early 20th century. That's a time that's in some senses like our own in terms of rocking from one crisis to the next. In Israel Zangvill's 1892 book, Children of the Ghetto, which is a novelistic impression of the East End, the famous Anglo-Jewish author wrote about the Shabbos Goyas, or fire Goyas. These were poor women, usually Irish Catholic women, who acted as fire stokers when Jewish East Enders were observing the Sabbath. No Jew ever touched a match or a candle or burned a piece of paper or even opened a letter, Zangvill wrote. The Goya did everything required on the Sabbath. There were presumably plenty of these kinds of everyday interactions in the Irish and Jewish East End, but it's the shared act of kindling the flames of revolution that I wanted to dwell on for now. It was from the radical world of East London that James Connolly, the revered Irish socialist, would find a comrade for Yiddish language translation work. In a 1988 article, Manus O'Riordan first presented the interesting tale of how Boris Kahan, a member of the East London Jewish branch of the Social Democratic Federation, worked on an election pamphlet for James Connolly. In 1902, Connolly put himself forward as a candidate for a council election in Wood Quay, Dublin. Because the electoral area took in Dublin's Little Jerusalem, the party contacted Boris Kahan in East London to secure a Yiddish translation of Connolly's election literature. The Kahans had their own Irish familial links, as O'Riordan noted in his article. Zelda Kahan, sister of Boris, later married William Peyton Coates, a trade unionist born in Kinsale. Major European events of the early 20th century, such as the war, the Irish Revolution, and the Russian Revolution, of course resonated with the Jewish diaspora in Britain, and that created some curious intersections of Irish and Jewish history. One was a fear within far-right and conservative circles that the Jews and the Irish, these two sets of troublesome strangers, were set to unite in a revolutionary movement. Another remarkable example of how these events of war and revolution created unique pathways in Irish Jewish history, this one tied to reality rather than conspiracy, came about because of Ireland's successful resistance of conscription and forced enlistment into the British Army during the First World War. In June 1916, the Foreign Jews Protection Committee against deportation to Russia and compulsion was set up in England to oppose Russian Empire-born Jews in the country being conscripted. Sharmin Kadish, in her research on how British Jews responded to the Russian Revolution, came across the curious case of Sam Ellsbury, a Russian-born Jewish man who was a tailor in Leeds and who was arrested during the First World War for evading the draft. Ellsbury managed to escape his police captors and fled to Ireland. Here he purchased an ex-soldier's papers and assumed that soldier's Irish name, John Dillon. Late in 1917, Kadish notes, John Dillon, the Irish tailor with a Yorkshire accent, joined the Yiddish-speaking subdivisional branch of the Tailors' Union in London, John Dillon being an unlikely name for a member of a Yiddish-speaking union. This same committee, the Foreign Jews Protection Committee, responded to the Russian Revolution with enthusiasm, and in March 1917 organized a meeting to commemorate it, advertised here in both English and Yiddish. One report of the meeting stated that the crowds broke forth into cheers and cries of enthusiasm, and continued that the crowd showed great welcome for the women speakers, an East London comrade who had suffered imprisonment, and an Irish woman, quote, for she too belonged to a race which is oppressed. Some other evidence of Irish and Jewish revolutionary converging points in Britain is tied to the kind of subversive trade that often passes through the port cities where Irish and Jews settled. Brian Hanley, in a recent article on anti-Semitism in Irish Republican politics, discovered fascinating evidence of IRA men purchasing weapons from Jewish arms dealers in Britain during the War of Independence. Hanley cites a June 1921 British intelligence report that claimed war material reaches Ireland from Manchester in considerable quantities, and Jews are said to be active in sending these consignments. One name that should not go without mention in any history of radical Irish Jewish East London is that of Max Levitas, a Dublin-born Jewish revolutionary whose family eventually settled in the East End. Involved with communist politics from his teenage years when he first began working as a tailor, Max was a participant in the famous Battle of Cable Street, when Jewish East Londoners, supported by leftists and some Irish locals, faced down a march of British fascists. Bill Fishman, a witness to the events, remembered how the people up the top of the flats, mainly Irish Catholic women, threw rubbish on the police. Fishman recalled being moved to tears by the sight of the Irish and the Jews standing together. Another witness, Charlie Goodman, recalled similarly that the most amazing thing was to see a silk-coated Orthodox Jew standing next to an Irish docker with a grappling iron. This was absolutely unbelievable. Yet both memories emphasized a profound feeling of surprise, suggesting the ephemeral nature of the intercommunal East London solidarity. Max Levitas remained committed anti-fascist until his death in 2018, aged 103. All of these stories don't suggest a wide-scale convergence of Irish Jewish radical forces in the early 20th century, nor that such a combined effort was ever likely. To unduly focus on exceptions rather than the norm in Irish Jewish history can put us at risk of consuming excess amounts of what Natalie Wynne has criticised as feel-good factor histories. Accounts that overstate Jewish involvement in Irish nationalism and perhaps also radicalism, and understate Irish anti-Semitism. Broadening our perspective from the individual curiosities of Irish Jewish comradeship, we discover a history of two communities whose proximity often resulted in tension or indifference, in addition to collaboration and mutual influence. Bronwyn Walter notes of the Irish and Jewish East End that although social intermixing took place, cultural differences, based particularly around religious beliefs and practices, ensured that distinctive backgrounds remained salient. The communities could occasionally come into combat with one another, in some cases quite literally. In the 19th century, bare-knuckle boxing was a sport that attracted a large number of Irish and Jewish Londoners who took to the rings to face each other down. So let's consider another Irish-Jewish migrant world in another city and country, the Lower East Side of New York in the US. Fiction and poetry are sometimes sources neglected by historians, yet long out of print writings by people connected to the worlds where research can provide unique insights. In the 30s, as Charles Fanning notes, a generation of writers emerged in the US who sought to capture in writing their experiences as the children of immigrant parents. So let's take two writers whose accounts of their respective communities received widespread acclaim to help us open a window into the intersecting worlds of Irish and Jewish America, fiction of Mike Gold and James T. Farrell. In 1930, Mike Gold, the son of Romanian Jewish immigrant parents, released his major work, Jews Without Money, a semi-autobiographical novel about a Jewish family, the Golds, and their lives in a New York City tenement. In a chapter on the tenement interactions between working class Jews and the other poor immigrants they lived alongside, Mikey Gold, the stand-in character for Mike Gold, remembers how my mother was opposed to the Italians, Irish, Germans, and every other variety of Christian with whom we were surrounded. May 80 black years fall on these guys, she said, her black eyes flashing. They may seem friendly to us to our faces, but behind our backs they laugh at us. Mikey Gold recalled that to his mother, Christians did not seem like people to her. They were abstractions. They were the great enemy to be hated, feared, and cursed. And yet it was through his mother's interactions with an Irish family who lived in their tenement building that Gold learned how his mother was, quote, incapable of real hatred. She had warm friends among the Italian and Irish neighbours, and Gold recalled how she was always apologetic about that, noting that these are good people, not like other Christians. In the novel, the Golds lived a largely separate life from the O'Briens, the Irish family who lived upstairs. One day, Mrs. O'Brien stormed through the door of the Golds' house in terror, asking for help as her son was choking on a fishbone. After intervening and saving the boy's life, Gold's mother had a long discussion with her Irish neighbour and became attached to the woman, who was struggling with an abusive partner and a chronically ill child. The Jewish mother encouraged her son Mikey to play with his bedridden Irish Catholic counterpart. Mikey Gold ascended upstairs and crossed the threshold of the Irish apartment, bringing with him a spinning top that he intended to show to the other young immigrant boy. But he was too feeble for the sport, Gold wrote, so he wept once more, and I was grieved for him. Was this one of the dreaded Christians? Gold, a writer but also a revolutionary, had an expressed interest in convincing his readers that the inter-community tensions of the working class were not immutable, that they could be overcome. The sketches in this book are not, as Richard Truark underlines, a series of rough-hewn memoirs, but a carefully worked, unified piece of art. And yet I find that Gold's writing has a ring of authenticity, and it's suggestive of how those stereotypes kept these two communities at a distance, as certain human necessities and the inescapable fact of proximity born out of shared tenement life fostered sympathetic encounters. Mike Gold's writing also suggests how this proximity could reshape old animosities, a process which is rendered in detail by the Chicago Irish writer James T. Farrell. In particular, I want to use Farrell's writing to ask the important question of where Irish prejudice against Jews fits into the history of the Irish abroad. Natalie Wynne has noted that anti-Jewish prejudice has been shown to be a complex and nuanced matter, requiring a careful choice of language and clear criteria before any worthwhile observations can be advanced. There is a vast and evolving scholarship on how we define anti-Semitism historically, and when I use the term, I try my best to remain aware of these discussions. When I was living in Silicon Valley on an exchange in 2019, I became interested in the broader topic of online radicalization of young, largely white men of my own generation who were driven to the far right through engagement with the technology products offered by the same CEOs with whom I shared a local coffee shop. Thinking about the question historically, I went to the Stanford Library and ordered up a novel written by the Irish-American writer James T. Farrell. Farrell's short book, Tommy Gallagher's Crusade, published in 1939, tells the story of young Tommy Gallagher, an Irish newspaper boy in New York City who develops a hatred of Jews after he falls under the sway of Father Moylan, a far-right radio personality. In this sequence here, we find young Gallagher at a meeting letting out a roaring demand for free speech for Father Moylan, who had, as a result of his racist distortions, been dropped from the airwaves. Tommy Gallagher was a fictional stand-in for an Irish-American archetype. The kind of working-class Catholic youth could be found in New York, in Chicago, Boston, and many other cities. But Father Moylan was an extremely lightly fictionalized representation of a real figure, and a version of the protest that Tommy Gallagher attended in the book did in fact take place. Father Charles Coughlin, the real-life version of Farrell's character Father Moylan, is a figure whose malign influence looms large, perhaps disproportionately so, over any discussion of Irish and Jewish intercommunal relations in the mid-20th century United States. Coughlin was born in Ontario, Canada, to parents of Irish ancestry, and you need to trace back 3 generations from Charles Coughlin to find his roots in Ireland, which can be traced back to Cork. Although often described as speaking with an Irish brogue and sometimes even described as an Irishman, Coughlin identified himself as a staunch American and was hardly an advocate for immigrant identities. What is clear, however, is how popular this man, who came to be known simply as the radio priest, was among a certain section of Catholic Americans. Soon after beginning his broadcasts from Detroit, Michigan, Coughlin began to gain listeners, reaching millions by the close of the 1920s with his melodious voice and homilies. Initially, his broadcasts were largely religious, but by 1930, he began to speak more about politics. Although initially a proponent of Roosevelt's New Deal, by 1936, Coughlin turned sharply against Roosevelt, and by 1938 was propounding that international bankers and Bolsheviks were in league to destroy the world. Like many far-right figures before and since, Coughlin understood progressive politics, international finance, and Jewish identity as largely synonymous, working within an anti-Semitic worldview that scholars define as the Judeo-Bolshevik mythology. And this myth of ethno-religious threat has been recently and authoritatively outlined in Paul Hannenberg's excellent study of the topic. Coughlin had a specific intellectual and spiritual guide who drew him deeper into this conspiratorial view, a Tipperary-born priest by the name of Father Dennis Fahey. Born in Golden, County Tipperary and educated at Rockwell College in Tipperary, Dennis Fahey was the author of Traditionalist Catholic Tracts. His book, The Rulers of Russia, in particular, was a work dedicated to fueling an ever-evolving conspiracy which claimed that Jews were behind the Russian Revolution and global Bolshevism. In the 1980s, Mary Christine Athens, a historian of Catholicism, came across a trunk-like box of papers in the Holy Ghost Missionary College in Kimmage that were written to Father Dennis Fahey from Father Charles Coughlin. Spanning over decades, the letters reveal details of the personal and intellectual link between the two men. Coughlin described Fahey as one of the most outstanding scholars in Ireland and echoed Fahey's conspiracies in his broadcasts. In 1938, Coughlin's ideology attracted both national condemnation and international attention. Following Kristallnacht, the November 1938 pogrom in Nazi Germany, Coughlin broadcast a response to the events. As David Goodman notes, Coughlin's description of the events echoed the Nazi explanation. Coughlin stated German anti-Semitism was actually anti-communism and that it was explicable because the Soviet leadership was largely Jewish. In a Radio First, a New York station announced at the program's conclusion, Father Coughlin has made some mistakes of fact. Coughlin's falsities also led to two political figures normally dramatically at odds, briefly joining the same side of an argument. Both Leon Trotsky and his old nemesis Alexander Kerensky publicly refuted Coughlin's Father Fahey-inspired lie that Bolshevism was a Jewish plot. Several stations removed Coughlin from their platforms in an unprecedented move, yet on November 27th, Coughlin returned to the airwaves that he still had access to. Coughlin stated in his follow-up program, "Let me introduce into court as my witness the scholarly Professor Dennis Fahey," then proceeded to read from one of Fahey's pamphlets. What gives this story a dark relevance in the history of Irish-Jewish relations in the US is not just Coughlin's distant Irish ancestry and direct Irish inspiration, but the violent street movement and even one terror plot with the alleged involvement of 11 Irishmen that this series of events inspired. In New York, where WMCA, the first station to drop Coughlin's broadcast, was headquartered, the Christian Front, a Coughlinite street movement, began a series of so-called free speech protests. Ronald H. Baylor, in his work on Irish, German, Jewish, and Italian communities in New York, argued that the Irish, more than any other ethnic group in the city, were the prime audience for Coughlin's anti-Semitism. The American Jewish Congress Archives contains a 61-page memorandum outlining street fights and violence that occurred in late 1939 in response to the emergence of the Christian Front. Reported in a number of cases of Coughlinites insulting people who they believed to be Jewish, picketing Jewish business, and physically attacking those who opposed them. Among those listed as being arrested for disorderly conduct are a number of Irish names, including Mahoney, Power, and Hayes. Although the Christian Front, and what may be called Coughlinism, made inroads in Irish communities across the US, particularly in Boston and New York, it did not arise in these communities entirely without pushback. There are two people whose names should not go without mention in this regard. Michael Sayers, an Irish Jewish journalist who worked for the investigative tabloid PM during the 1940s and wrote exposés on anti-Semitism both within Ireland and Irish America, and Francis Sweeney, a courageous and little-known Irish-American anti-fascist reporter who was influential in Boston. And I wanted, in concluding my talk, to look in particular at Frances Sweeney, who I think deserves to be better known. In October 1942, Life magazine carried this report on Frances Sweeney, noting that she was an Irish Catholic girl who was first to note that seditious stories were widely circulated among her own people. Coming to the sensible conclusion that the Axis was exploiting traditional Irish hatred for the British, she conceived and helped to found Boston's rumour-fighting organisation. Though she has no official status and has been cold-shouldered because she dared to attack some of Boston's politicians and churchmen, she has kept up the good work on her own. Sweeney had in fact began her work against far-right disinformation years before, when she became particularly dismayed by anti-Semitism within the Boston Irish community and the failure of the church hierarchy to denounce it. She established the Boston City Reporter to highlight this issue and also helped to found the American Irish Defense Association, an organization tasked with promoting Irish American support for the Allied war effort against Nazi Germany and countering anti-Semitism. One of her reporters, Nat Hentoff, recalled that as a devout Catholic, Frances Sweeney saw anti-Semitism as an abomination, a direct scandal to the faith which the faithful had to combat. When, in 1942, Father Edward Curran, a Coughlin ally, isolationist, and a member of Irish American organizations, was invited to speak at a Boston St. Patrick's Day meeting, Frances Sweeney entered the auditorium to report on the gathering, but was identified and physically removed from the premises. She died 2 years later, in June 1944, after suffering a heart attack that arose from lifelong cardiac issues. Only 36 years old at the time of her death, her legacy lived on for years after, when comrades formed the Frances Sweeney Committee to continue to root out anti-Jewish prejudice in Boston. Frances Sweeney's career is little known, and it would seem somewhat difficult to piece together in detail. She left behind no personal archive, and so to reconstruct her career requires that we look to those who worked for her. In short paragraphs and old biographies, you can find a really palpable sense of admiration. As someone who never worked alone, indeed, as someone who has established an organization, the American Irish Defense Association, that reflected her cause and commitment to challenging the hatred within her own community, Sweeney's life also reflects the complexities of Irish and Jewish intercommunal histories in the modern US. This history cannot neatly be siloed into a story of unrelenting tension, nor a story of uncomplicated cooperation. Irish Jewish history and the history of the people who navigated the hyphen between those two worlds will never provide us with a straightforward story, and that's precisely what makes it so worthy of study. It's a history that can displace othering narratives to show commonalities of experience and calls on us to ask what meaningful solidarity and collaboration between immigrant groups might look like. So that concludes my survey of some of the topics that and events that have been interesting me in this world. But before we move on to our conversation with Professor Hasia Diner, I wanted to draw your attention to some forthcoming talks. So firstly, our next two talks in this series. In April, we're going to be looking at the Irish traveller community abroad. So that should be a particularly fascinating and interesting talk. And then we'll be turning to migrant communities in modern Ireland, looking at the contributions of migrants to Irish society. And I'm sure there will be some discussion of the Jewish community in Ireland in that talk. I'm also looking forward to learning from and participating in a series organized by Tricia Kessler with the Woolf Institute in Cambridge titled Jews of Ireland and Irish Jewish Encounters. That's taking place over 3 weeks in March, the 2nd, the 9th, and the 16th. And you can register for that series of talks online at the website of the Woolf Institute. And I'm sure a lot of the topics and issues that will be discussed tonight will be looked at by a whole range of experts in those talks. So I will introduce our guest for this evening. The next part of our event is very much in the spirit of Frances Sweeney, talking about actions and people that reflect the meaningful points of collaboration between the Irish and Jewish populations of the US. It's a great honor to be joined by Professor Hasia Diner, who is the current Paul and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American History of American Jewish history at NYU. Her work has explored many corners of the American immigrant story, with a particular focus on Jewish-Irish experiences. Hasia's current project asks how the Irish taught the Jews to become Americans, and her previous publications have included Erin's Daughters in America, Irish Immigrant Women in the 19th Century, in addition to many works of American Jewish history. So, greetings, Hasia. You're very welcome to join us for this virtual gathering tonight.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really an honor. And there's something really strange about talking this way on Zoom and knowing that there are people behind us in all sorts of corners. But it's really a pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah. No, it's great. And we have a large number of people, which is great. And I think it shows the interest in this kind of history. And it's one of the benefits, I guess, of this strange period is that we can reach people across the world with this talk. I did want to also note to the audience, please feel free to drop questions now for me or Hasia to talk about the Irish Jewish experience more broadly, or any of the kind of topics that we've already discussed in the talk. So please feel free to drop in your questions at any point. But Hasia, I wanted to begin. When we spoke before, you made the important point that the story of Father Charles Coughlin and the Christian Front is a deviation, not a culmination in Irish Jewish history. And thinking along those lines, I wanted to tell us more about your current project. So what is the story that you're going to tell, and how does it differ from other understandings of Irish Jewish America?
Okay, thank you. So yes, I see the Coughlin story as a kind of false kind of point of destination for much of the scholarship. I think that's really wrong, and it really is a kind of aberration. Rather, from the time that the large Jewish migration to the United States really takes off in the 1870s and 1880s, they encountered in the United States a country they had come to, a nation they had come to as permanent immigrants. They encountered there this very sizable, highly visible, assertive, settled Irish population, and it's a population that had two parts of its profile that were important. On the one hand, they controlled some really important institutions and sites of access to American society, and the political machine, the labor movement, the public schools in the biggest cities are just three examples of this. So they controlled those settings. But on the other hand, like the Jews, they saw themselves, and reasonably, as kind of victims of and objects of derision by the kind of white Protestant native-born elite, which questioned the ability of either one of them to actually become American. The Irish, as America's first large Catholic immigrant population, really challenged the basic idea of America as a Protestant nation. I mean, it was a Protestant nation. And here are these millions of Catholics coming in, and the Irish really challenged that view in a very assertive manner. On the other hand, Jews are the first non-Christian group to come to the United States, in any number. And really, they're not going to be the largest non-Christian group until the late 1960s and 70s with the passage of new immigration restriction, when there's a serious influx of Hindus and Muslims and so on. So the Jews too challenge America's idea of who is an American. Until then, an American had to be a Christian. And so there was a kind of commonality of understanding that there's this world out there, this American world that they have to accommodate to it, but they're not going to just accommodate to it, they have to get it to change. And in this process, the Jews, who are smaller in number, who are later arrivals, and I'm going to say way less assertive and less willing to be outrageous, turn to the Irish either directly or indirectly to guide them in this process of what I'm calling becoming American.
Mhm.
And so I've been interested in the course of this research to look at the ways, both the points of intersection, the ways in which both parties to this alliance, we could call it, or this encounter, what they both get out of it, because both of them have something to gain from it, and the way in which their engagement with each other served as a kind of powerful weapon in forcing America to become a very different place than it had been.
Mm. And I wonder then, thinking about the sort of direct, you were talking about direct and indirect, where were the spaces of encounter? What were the institutions of encounter? Was it schools? Was it, you know?
Right. Yes, that's great. So I'm interested in a number of settings. And so first, the political machine. I mean, everything grew out of politics, and Tip O'Neill told us all politics is local, and a local means how you get a license to open a store, how you get a policeman to not enforce a infraction of the law that you've committed, how to get your some kind of service you needed, really nitty gritty kinds of needs. Politics is also how you get visibility, power, a good income, and one biography after another of American Jews in, again, New York, Chicago, Boston, particularly male until much later, begins with that story of entry, going to their ward captain for something.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, asking for help. And now it's always in return for a favor, and the favor is the vote. Okay, and the favor is also to then go out and work for the machine. Now, the machine is Irish. Chicago and Boston are different than New York in that they had multiple machines, but all the machines are Irish. New York has Tammany Hall, and although there were factions, Tammany still ruled with a kind of the claw of the tiger, as it were. And these became places where young Jewish men got their footholds into kind of positions of middle class positions of, again, some kind of visibility in the society, access to American life. So I'm really interested in the political machine as it functioned. Okay, the Irish let the Jews in because that's what they're doing, not because they necessarily love the Jews or because they believe in religious tolerance, but they realize they need the Jews' vote. And the Jews are there as permanent immigrants, and they are going to vote. They're going to naturalize, they're going to get citizenship, and they're going to vote, and the Irish need them. And so it's a real, kind of, let's kind of scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. So while the machine has gotten a really negative view in much of the scholarship, I think it was a really important instrument of integration. Secondly, partly because of the role of the machine, school teachers in the three big cities, again, that I've mentioned, New York, Chicago, Boston, were predominantly Irish American women. That's the job, that was the profession of respectability that the daughters of Irish immigrants flocked to. They got education. It was a clean job. It was probably pretty terrible, but it was better than working in a factory. And they tended to be, and you got your job through the machine. So this was long before the kind of neutral civil service. And many of these women worked in the Jewish immigrant neighborhoods. And so I think we could say with some real good certainty that most Jewish immigrant children, or the American-born first generation of the Jewish immigrants, their teachers were Irish women, and these are the instruments of American culture. They taught them who is George Washington, who is Abraham Lincoln, how do you speak? These kids came from non-English speaking homes. What does it mean to look like an American? Well, it's that white blouse, it's the hairdo, and they really served as the model. And you had mentioned Nat Hentoff. So he grew up in Boston, and he describes himself in his autobiography as a pretty desultory student. He had no desire to go on to the Boston Latin School, which was really the kind of point of entry to getting into college if you lived in Boston. He said he didn't want to go. It wasn't worth the effort. His teacher, an Irish woman, and he said, all of my teachers were Irish. She came to his mother's house, and she said to his mother, you have to force him to go to take the exam to go to the Latin school. So there is just in one person's story that helping the Jews to become American. And it's fascinating how kind of has that entry into journalism, by the way, through Francis Sweeney. So the public schools are really of tremendous interest to me. There was a young Irish American woman, she actually had been born in Dublin, whose father was a doctor in the Lower East Side, and her name was Myra Kelly, and she taught in the New York, in an all Jewish public school. And she went on to write a number of short stories and then books about her experience as a teacher in these Jewish immigrant schools. And the books are called Little Aliens and Little Citizens and Wards of Liberty. And if they're true or not is really not important, but they present to the American public these kids. Thirdly, I'm interested in the labor movement. So Jews come into the American working class, primarily in the garment trade, and they come with no experience in labor organizing. And they come with no experience in labor organizing in a multi-ethnic setting. And they're constantly turning to, seeking advice, getting brokered into the labor movement through Irish veterans. I mean, they've been involved in the labor movement since, the days of the Molly Maguires and then the Knights of Labor. And they really have those years of experience under their belt. Okay, and then finally, as a kind of setting for this actual personal encounter is I want to look at particularly starting at about the 1910s, the opening up of the doors in Catholic universities, all of which are founded by Irish orders, have Irish boards of trustees, Irish administrators. They open their doors to Jewish applicants studying law, medicine, dentistry, pharmacy, commerce. And so here is the Jewish point of entry into the American professions. And when other non-Catholic schools were setting up quotas against Jews, the Catholic schools are saying, fine, we'll take them. And so schools like Fordham, the law schools at Fordham and St. John's are at some point 16, 70% Jewish. So here are Irish Catholic institutions, one Fordham by the Jesuits, St. John's by the Vincentians. It's essentially training the first generation of Jewish professionals. Fordham's pharmacy school was again about 70% Jewish. It has a Jewish dean in the 1920s. And so here's again another kind of door that's opened now these are tuition paying students. Again, it's not out of love. It's not out of a kind of understanding that we're all in this together. These are tuition paying students who become loyal alumni. So there is a figure known to New Yorkers, Louis Lefkowitz, who was in state government forever and ever. And he was a graduate of Fordham's Law School. He was the treasurer of the state of New York. He is a graduate of Fordham Law School. And every year he went out to fundraise for Fordham. Okay, so Fordham, and one might say the Irish Jesuits behind it, gained a lot from educating Louis Lefkowitz and his peers. And for Louis Lefkowitz, a kid growing up in the Bronx who couldn't afford to go anyplace else, he was living at home, it was Fordham. So it's this kind of, let's call it a marriage of convenience, but it may not be built on love. It may not be have been built on, again, a kind of ideological commitment to pluralism, but rather we need each other. And so I'm interested in those places of encounter. And do let me know, by the way, what the timing is here, because
Yeah.
I also am interested in a group of Irish American writers, which will culminate in France in Sweeney, who use their power of the pen, as it were, their journalistic and reportage to defend the Jews. And it goes back to John Boyle O'Reilly in the 1870s, who uses the Boston Pilot to expose anti-Semitism. And indeed, particularly when it's done by the local Boston elite, the local Boston Protestant elite. And Michael Davitt's writing about the pogrom in Kishinev. John Boyle O'Reilly's daughter writes an expose on the Mendel Bayless blood libel in Kishinev, in Kiev, and she actually has gets an exclusive interview with the chief rabbi of Kiev, and writes about this. The first full-length book on the history of the Jews of the United States is written by a New York judge named Charles P. Daly, who's also very active in all the Irish communal in the AO, Ancient Order of Hibernians, and so on. And I'm sorry, in the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick. And he writes the first history of the Jews of the United States. Okay, as the immigration debate is raging, and he says, don't think of the Jews as aliens. They've been here since the 17th century. So he's the defender of the Jews. And I also just want to include a very short just nod to a historical project launched in the 1920s by the Knights of Columbus. And again, it's a Catholic fraternal order, but it's almost exclusively Irish. And a man by the name of Edward McSweeney, who is so concerned about the Ku Klux Klan and the danger it posed to Catholics in the United States, that he launches a historical series, a series of books on the contributions of racial groups to America. And it's an attack on the Klan. And out of this comes a book called The Jewish Contribution to America. So here's an Irish Catholic organization funding and disseminating a book of defense of the Jews through under its imprimatur. And then Frances Sweeney is again a kind of she is the one who's the culmination, not Coughlin.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating overview. I hadn't heard about a lot of those writers. I knew of David, of course, but I also thought that was the marriage of convenience metaphor was great. And it made me think of, who was the witness to this marriage? We're talking about these communities comprehending each other, but were there outside observers of this process? And I think I'm thinking even kind of cultural representations, that series of movies, the Coens and the Kellys, or that song, If It Weren't for the Jews and the Irish, is that outsiders speaking about this happening?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there are a couple levels of thinking about that. On the one hand, people who are advocates for political positions or for advocacy for their group or for another group, they do what they do, and they cannot control how others consume their texts. And so I'm on some level really interested in the fact that the Irish do this for the Jews, and where the chips fall, how the larger American public consumes it is beyond their control. But it's interesting, I'm thinking of one of the Myra Kelly books, the one called Wards of Liberty. She got Theodore Roosevelt to write the preface to the book. So she gets a former president to state, again, at the height of the immigration debate, she gets the former president of the United States to write how many, the heroine of these books is a teacher by the name of Miss Bailey. And he says there were so many Miss Baileys, there to teach the eager Russian Jewish children. So it is getting picked up, as it were, by other Americans. And to what degree do they succeed? Well, they couldn't prevent immigration restriction, okay, which is one area in which much of this was focused on. But on the other hand, I think that they they do get the attention of a larger swath of the American public. In 1915, President Woodrow Wilson nominated Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court. So he's a Boston lawyer, and not usually ever associated with kind of Irish American history, although there's some amazing connections. But his own senator was Henry Cabot Lodge. Now, traditionally, the senator of the state of the nominee is a supporter. Henry Cabot Lodge is the major opponent to Brandeis, even though they're from the same state. But it was James Michael Curley who came to the defense of Brandeis in the Senate. Okay, so the second time, now Brandeis is nominated twice. The first time it failed, but the second time when Curley was there fighting for Brandeis, he made it. And so, how does this all add up? I think it's a slow process of advocacy, a slow process of allyship. And to me, what is remarkable is the doing of it. And the fact that in a place like the United States, but no doubt elsewhere as well, made up of many different peoples, okay, there's a kind of kaleidoscope of interactions. And among that kind of kaleidoscopic structure, the Jews and the Irish saw in each other something that was that each one saw something that could be useful in that encounter.
So it's interesting that you mentioned Myra Kelly, because that's actually one of the questions that we got in from Dan Sands, who's asking, are you familiar with the work of Myra Kelly? So clearly you are, Hasia. I hadn't heard of her before, but sounds fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, the stories are really, they are so early 20th century, you almost kind of grimace. They're so sweet, and there's not really, every story has a little moment of tension, and then Miss Bailey is able to smooth over whatever differences or sort of tension is there. But they're very sweet. They were extremely popular. And that's, again, a good answer to your question about notice. They're published not in Jewish magazines, not in Irish magazines, but in like the Saturday Evening Post. So that means that Americans around the country have access to these stories about these Russian Jewish kids and this Irish American teacher.
So there's a few other questions in from the audience as well. Interesting one from David Toms, who asks, why do you think the interest in this topic and broader histories of Irish-Jewish connection has begun to gain traction?
Okay, I mean, that's a great question. And, so one thing I really want to give a nod to Cormac O'Grada's important book on the Jews of Ireland. And I think that had a real impact on the field. But I think that in this moment in time, in the early 21st century, or maybe it's not even so early any longer, when we think about when our society, at least American society, seems to be fracturing along the lines of, I do this for my group, you do this for your group, where it's all about self-interest, that historians and maybe public figures are beginning to think about the ways in which people actually came together. And rather than sort of thinking about issues of the day and as such of the history in a kind of siloed approach, it's about me, it's about my group, it's about what's good for me, is to understand that those silos never existed, and that the strength of American society derived from the fact that people met each other in new ways in the United States. And if they liked it or not, they lived near each other, and that they derived strength from it. And in some ways, I think this might be a model for thinking about the kind of America that we hope will emerge in this, very dangerous time that we're in now, where it's always about what's good for me.
I think also there's a kind of a parallel process, I think, happening in Ireland, in a sense, a greater search for a diverse history of Ireland and a greater understanding of the diversity of Irishness. And so I think the interest in Irish Jewish history is one part of that emerging interest, which also connects into Black Irish history and history of all other migrant groups coming into Ireland as well. And there's another, sorry, what was I going to say? And also, I think it's also interesting that this Irish-Jewish connection, or an Irish sense of feeling pride of a Jewish connection, is not new, right? In the early 20th century, you have Irish politicians, even like local Irish Jewish figures, saying Ireland's great because there's never been anti-Semitism in Ireland. Of course, untrue, but they say it, and it indicates some kind of pride that they take in Ireland's supposed stance against it. So I think it's interesting that there definitely seems to be a great interest in it now, but there's an ebb and flow of interest in the Jewish community in Ireland. I mean, it's no coincidence that Leopold Bloom is Jewish in Ulysses and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I think, by the way, another topic, which I may or may not deal with in the book, but it's really fascinating, is that Zionists in the United States were, and I don't mean to use a trade expression, green with envy over Irish nationalism. The American Zionists were constantly wringing their hands about their own failure to enlist the masses, to get the kind of rank and file Jews, into Zionist organizations, to give money to Zionist organizations. And they kept saying, how come the Irish can do it? That's where we have to look for inspiration. That's where we have to look for models for how to instill a spirit of nationalism in our people. And the fact that these two movements, however we're going to assess them historically, or what the implications of what they did and how they did it, the fact that they arose at the same moment in time, right? And that they coalesced around a kind of message that without a land, you can't be free. Okay, and the majority of Irish Americans are not going to move back to Ireland once it's free, and the majority of American Jews are not going to move to their hoped for homeland. But the idea that their own sense of worth in the larger American society would be enhanced by having a cause and having a homeland cause, and the fact that they're happening at the same time. And really, the Zionists are just always looking at the Irish. American Zionist magazines are full of articles about Irish organizing, and why can't we be like that?
So I wanted to also get to, there's two more questions from the audience that I wanted to get. Perhaps we could even link them together. Jerry Malumbi asks about Irish and Jewish immigrants in the UK and the USA collaborating in show business. So working in getting the bums on seats of cinema and theatre. And Alison Chapp asks a separate question, noting that my two grandfathers grew up in the Bronx, one Russian Jewish and one Irish. This is in the 1930s and 40s. Are you aware of any interactions their two communities might have had? Perhaps show business.
Okay, so maybe let me do the second one. So I assume the question is ultimately a question about intermarriage between Irish and Jews, since she has a grandfather on either side. Yeah, I mean, I think it was not uncommon. It was, and again, I'm really interested up through the 1930s, because I'm going to end with the Francis Sweeney attack on Coughlin. But it was at a time when there were relatively low rates of Jewish intermarriage or Jewish marriage outside of the group. The Irish Jewish one was not uncommon, or was more common than many others. And it's certainly the stuff of movies. Okay, you began with the poster of the Kellys and the Cohens, and there was AB's Irish Rose. There's a famous novel. It was a Yiddish novel by, it's been translated into English by Sholem Asch, called East River. And the plot line is this Irish, and so almost always an Irish Catholic young woman and a Jewish man. And so the plot line of East River, this story runs on that romance, the marriage, obviously the families are very unhappy. It's not a happy story, but the theme is there. And I think, which maybe takes us a little back to why this is so interesting, because in as much as the people seem so different, and that's why it's, I think, fascinating. On show business, yeah, I mean, vaudeville, the movies, the whole gamut of kind of Tin Pan Alley was a place where Jews and Irish met. The Irish are there first, the Jews come in, and they again see a kind of role model of going in and out of ethnic themes, masquerading. I mean, taking on different identities, playing all sorts of characters. Obviously, both Jews and Irish engage in blackface. Okay? And David Lott has something to say about the differences between Jewish and Irish blackface, but they both do it. And again, in your description, you made a reference to that song, If It Wasn't for the Irish and the Jews. And that song was written by a pair of two songwriters, one Irish, one Jewish. And so this kind of collaboration and the points of access into American popular culture, I think, was something that really brought them together. And it's a kind of sneering at American society, at American sort of proper WASP society. And in that song, and unfortunately I don't have the lyrics in front of me, but the final verse said, if it wasn't for what the Irish and the Jews do, is they drive away the blues, okay, from the little USA. And they drive away the blues from Yankee Land. And so the two of them together kind of push off the center of the stage, that kind of dour, Puritan, white, kind of native-born seriousness. Now, it's all exaggerated, but that's the kind of image they project.
Mm. So I wonder, do we have any further questions from the audience before we wrap up? I'll just wait and see if there are any other questions, but I hope we have at least driven away some of the blues of your evening with what has been, for me, a fascinating discussion. So thank you very much, Hasia. I've learned a lot. Yeah, I think it's Irish Jewish history, just a really amazing field. It's developing, so many talented people working on it, and I think that it tells not only the story of the Irish and the Jews, it allows us to tell broader stories about immigrant identity as well. I
mean, I like to say, when people ask, why am I doing this? And since I come to this primarily through the trajectory of American Jewish history, I like to say that Jews were not the authors of their own destiny, that their history in America had a co-authorship. And that there's this other group of people who, for their own reasons, participated in shaping that path. And that path is one about economics, it's about culture, it's about politics, and however much people like to pat themselves on the back, we did it ourselves. Mm. In a complex democratic society, there is no we did it ourselves. Mm. And everybody did it in some kind of partnership. And that to me is the takeaway.
Yeah, that's a great insight. We do have one final question.
Okay, sure.
From Tricia Kessler, who asked, what about the economy? Were there any crossovers in business?
Yeah, so I think that's, again, a really interesting question. And I think it's one reason that, now, which doesn't mean that there weren't, I mean, I've seen examples of law firms that were one Irish, one Jew, or a couple Irish, couple Jews. But for the most part, I think one reason this particular duo, this particular pairing worked is because they didn't compete with each other in the world of work. And that they had just very different economic profiles. You know, when Jews go into a limited number of occupations, I mean, they become very prominent in a number of fields, but they are really concentrated. The garment, you know, the clothing industry is one in which it's really, basically, that's the baseline of the Jewish economy. And something like scrap metal and so on. The Irish have a much broader economic profile, and the Jews and the Irish don't meet in those places, but because they don't meet there, they're not competing. And they don't compete for jobs. They go into such different forms of work. And but I do think the question is good, and it might be fascinating somebody to do a real detailed study of looking at city directories and seeing where there were firms that had both. As I said, I've only seen examples of law firms, and these were often young, you know, Jewish lawyers who had gone to places like Fordham and St. John's and Creighton, and they established then friendships with you know, Catholic, you know, Irish Catholic law students, and they graduate and they say, okay, let's open a business together, let's open a firm together. But it's a great question that really. I hope I answered it adequately, but I'm going to actually start looking.
Well, on that note, we're going to bring everything to a close. So I would like to thank you, Hasia, for joining us. That was really wonderful. And I would like to thank everyone who tuned in and watched along. It's really great to have your interest. And also, as ever, I'd like to particularly thank those who donated when they registered. The movement for asylum seekers in Ireland, which is a really important cause. So thanks, everyone, and hopefully see you at our next.
It was my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay.
So.